Edward Gein, also known as the Butcher of Plainfield, became one of the most infamous serial killers in American history. But much of the darkness that surrounded him stemmed from his deeply dysfunctional family life. Born on August 27, 1906, in La Crosse, Wisconsin, Edward Theodore Gein grew up in a small rural town, the son of George and Augusta Gein. His family dynamics and upbringing were instrumental in shaping the twisted individual he became. Augusta Gein, a dominating force. Augusta, Edward's mother, was a fanatically religious woman who held an extreme, puritanical worldview. She was a fervent believer in her own version of Christianity, preaching to her sons about the evils of the world, particularly focusing on the dangers of women, whom she considered sinful and corrupt. Augusta saw herself as morally superior to those around her and wanted to protect her children from what she saw as the wicked influences of society. Augusta ruled the household with an iron fist. She was emotionally abusive and deeply controlling, isolating her two sons, Edward and Henry, from other children. She viewed the outside world as morally bankrupt and limited their social interaction to school and their farm work. Edward was particularly devoted to his mother, while Henry, the older brother, eventually began to rebel against her suffocating control. George Gein, Edward's father, was the opposite of Augusta. He was a weak, alcoholic man who failed to provide much for the family. He struggled to keep jobs and was often the target of Augusta's contempt and ridicule. George's lack of authority in the family left Augusta firmly in control, and Edward was particularly shaped by her influence. A dark and twisted childhood. From a young age, Edward Gein exhibited signs of abnormal behavior. He was shy, awkward, and socially isolated, preferring the company of his mother to other children. Augusta drilled into her sons that sex and women were evil, leading Edward to develop an unhealthy and warped understanding of relationships, sexuality, and morality. Edward's education was also stunted by his mother's extreme influence. Though he was an average student, his lack of social interaction, combined with his mother's disturbing teachings, warped his worldview. He remained isolated on the family farm, which became a microcosm of Augusta's rigid control and authoritarian influence. As Edward grew into a young adult, his devotion to his mother intensified. The death of George and Henry Gein. In 1940, when Edward was 34, his father George died due to complications related to his alcoholism. This left Edward, Henry, and Augusta alone on the farm. Henry, who was growing tired of his mother's control, had begun to criticize Augusta in front of Edward. This caused tension between the brothers, as Edward was fiercely protective of their mother. In 1944, an incident occurred that would forever change the Gein family. Edward and Henry were burning brush on their property when the fire got out of control. Though the fire was eventually extinguished, Henry went missing. His body was later found by authorities, but the circumstances of his death were suspicious. While his official cause of death was listed as asphyxiation, there were bruises on his head that raised questions about whether Edward had played a role in his brother's death. Despite these suspicions, no charges were filed, and Henry's death was ruled accidental. The collapse of Edward Gein's world. The death of Henry left Edward and Augusta alone together, solidifying Edward's obsessive attachment to his mother. But just a year later, in 1945, Augusta suffered a stroke that left her incapacitated. Edward cared for her during this time, but she eventually died, leaving Edward completely alone. Augusta's death had a profound and devastating impact on Edward. She had been the only constant figure in his life, and without her, he was left adrift. He sealed off the rooms she had used in their farmhouse, preserving them like a shrine, while the rest of the house fell into decay and squalor. The descent into madness. With his mother gone and his mind spiraling into madness, Edward Gein began engaging in grotesque and macabre activities. He became obsessed with death, corpses, and anatomy, frequently visiting local cemeteries to exhume bodies. He would rob graves and use body parts for his twisted purposes, including creating furniture and clothing out of human skin. In 1957, police investigating the disappearance of Bernice Worden, a local hardware store owner, searched Gein's farmhouse and made a horrifying discovery. Inside, they found human remains, including skulls, organs, and the preserved skin of his victims. Gein had also confessed to the murders of two women, Bernice Worden and Mary Hogan, both of whom had gone missing from the local area. The legacy of Edward Gein. Edward Gein was ultimately found unfit to stand trial and was committed to a mental institution, where he lived until his death in 1984. His crimes shocked the nation and became the inspiration for several iconic characters in horror fiction, including Norman Bates from Psycho, Leatherface from the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and Buffalo Bill from The Silence of the Lambs. The dark and abusive environment created by Augusta Gein, along with Edward's twisted attachment to her, played a critical role in the development of his psychopathy. Edward Gein's story is a chilling example of how extreme isolation, abuse, and a distorted worldview can give rise to unimaginable horrors.